Greetings and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Just Teach. My name is Tamika and I'm one of the teachers on this platform. Just Teach is a podcast where we break down theological concepts to enhance your biblical and spiritual growth. Ezra 7:10 says, "For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments." Our effort at Just Teach is to seek, do, and teach the Word and will of God. If you have not already, please subscribe to the channel and click the all notifications bell. We upload weekly lessons, and your faithful engagement is certainly needed and most appreciated. We also want to take the time to invite you to visit us at our website, justteachministries.com. And there you'll find many Bible study resources. And on the store tab, you'll find lesson notes for all of the various passages that we've studied on this platform. And the notes are provided as the exact notes that are used in preparation for this presentation. A direct link will be provided in the description of the video to the lesson notes. And there's also a link in the top of the comments section, and they're available for a small donation. And we just want to say thank you to all of you who have been supporting our ministry. We appreciate you so much, and we appreciate you supporting and joining us every episode. We appreciate you. So let's jump right in. We are in week 5 of the UMI annual commentary. And our lesson is Remember God's Blessings. And that's coming from Deuteronomy 8, verses 6 through 20. Our key verse today is verse 11. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in the not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Now, we only have 2 points in this week's lesson, and that is remember God's blessings and don't become proud and forget the Lord. As we go through the lesson, our goal is going to be to identify the Lord as the source of all blessings, appreciate the blessings God gives us, and commit to be humble because God is the reason for our blessings. And as we're going through the lesson, I want you to keep this question at the back of your mind. Why should we be humble in a prideful world? Now, to give you some background, we are in the last book of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses. And Deuteronomy was actually written approximately 1407 to 1406 BC in that time frame. So this book was actually written to the new generation of Israelites that were about to be entering the promised land. So he wanted to remind the people of what God had done, encourage them to rededicate their lives to him. And also this book is the last sermon that Moses delivers to the people before they actually enter the promised land. Now, Deuteronomy is divided into 3 speeches, and that's chapter 1 through 4, chapter 5 through 26, and chapter 27 through 34. So these 3 speeches are by which in some sections he's reiterating the law handed down on Mount Sinai. And in other sections, he's updating the law from a religion to be practiced in the wilderness to one that is practiced in a stable homeland, focusing on the future of their nation. Now, we're also going to be discussing manna. Now, manna, that word in Hebrew is what is it? So this is the question that was asked when they first saw the grains that were provided by God. And it pretty much is food that came out of nothing. And they're like, what is this? So it's bread from heaven that fed the Israelites for 40 years of their wandering in the wilderness. Now, the Israelites coined the term when they first saw the miraculous flaky substance because it was flaky bread that was provided by God in the desert. Now, initially, they weren't able to recognize it. So it can also be understood as a gift or a portion in which they interpreted it. So considering it was considered to be food from heaven, and manna is a grain-like substance with sustain it's actually what sustained the Israelites during their 40 years in the wilderness. So it's small round grains or flakes that appeared around their camp each morning with the dew. So they were gathered, ground, and baked into cakes or boiled. God caused this manna to appear at the right time and it was placed there to meet their needs. And it was actually something that could not be stored, which is why it was new every morning, just as God's mercies are new every morning. And it was of little use to them beyond its immediate use. So it was something like they had to eat it right then and they couldn't keep it for later because it would go bad. So this meant that the Israelites had to daily rely on God for their provision of substance of manna. So just as God provided bread daily for his children in the natural, he also provides for us daily bread in the spirit through his word. It's just why we should read our word, and his word is how we communicate with him, how we get to know him, and we should be doing this on a daily basis. Matthew 4:4 tells us that man should not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. So today's text is actually coming from the third sermon related to the historical section of chapter 5. So the two previous sermons were based on the first commandment, but Israel is now to observe or be careful to follow the commandment of God. So obedience to God is associated with blessings and prosperity. Now, the people were reminded of the past 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and God's providence during that time. Now, the third sermon focuses on the future of Israel after all of their suffering and God's role in alleviating that suffering is forgotten. As in past times, the lure of worshiping other gods will become more appealing as new as generations with no personal knowledge of the events that occurred during their exodus out of Egypt, and succeeding events would become vulnerable to violating the first commandment. So, for Israel to understand that their blessings came from the hand of God, God knew that his people, he knew them and how easily they forget things, and also how they always try to credit themselves for their own prosperity and well being. So, Moses reiterates multiple times that their prosperity comes from God, in the hands of God only, and through their obedience to him. Now, Israel was about to enter the promised land. So Moses was preparing them for the next stage of their lives by reminding them again of their responsibility and their obligation to God and his laws, and how they should live in order to reap the benefits of the land. So this brings us to our first point. Now that we got the background out the way, remember God's blessings. Therefore, thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a land of brooks and water, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that springs out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. Thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he giveth thee. So we see here that God has provided for the Israelites in every aspect of their lives. I even think back to their wandering in the desert. How do people wander for 40 years with no resources and never run out of clothing, food? I mean, I'm just stuck on the clothing alone. People grow, children grow, clothes wear out. How on earth did they remain clothed during this 40-year process? Only God can do something like that. So they needed to remember the ways to which God supplied their needs. They needed to remember the bitter and difficult times that God brought them through. So God humbled them for that reason. He wanted to show them, one, what they were made of, but he also wanted them to know what was really important. He was bringing them into a prosperous land and wanted to make sure they remembered what God had already done and what he promised to do. And also, Israel spent 40 years as nomads. So, nomads are actually people with no fixed home who move from place to place. This is literally what they were doing for 40 years. So, traditionally, for resources like pasture or game, or in modern concepts like today, we have digital nomads who work remotely while traveling different places. So, Moses describes Canaan, the promised land, as a land that was rich in natural resources. Now, the promised land was always described metaphorically as a land flowing with milk and honey. We see that in Exodus 3:8, verse 17, as well as chapter 13, verse 5. Now, water was a very precious commodity and resource, given that most of the land they traveled for 40 years was dry. It was desert territory. So they were now about to enter a land with plenteous resources, water being one. Now, this land, it was adorned with natural water reserves, brooks, fountains, and deep reservoirs of water that shoot or spring out in the valleys and hills. Now, this will make the land fertile because where you have an abundance of water, you have fertile ground. And that assurance and abundance of crops and production of fruit. Now, that also guarantees grains, fruit trees, honey, and also minerals were mentioned like iron, brass, and copper. There would be enough resources that there would be no scarcity whatsoever. Now, the Hebrew word for scarceness or scarcity means poverty or misery. So they would no longer be in a place of poverty or misery, but God would supply everything that they needed just as he had before, and they would lack nothing in food or natural mineral resources. So Moses warned the people against being loose and lacking in their worship of the Lord or apostasy. So when they would enjoy the riches of the land, they needed to remember who got them there and who supplied it all. So, given that they were God's people and how God was about to bless them, Israel needed to receive that blessing with thanksgiving and humility. Now, the Israelites also needed to be disciplined people who remained loyal to their commands, to the commands of the Lord and his statutes, and again, to God, their deliverer. That brings us to our second point. Don't become proud and forget the Lord. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through the great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there is no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thine heart, my power and my might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day that ye shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyeth before your face, so shall ye perish, because ye would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. So now we see here the common response of the Israelites in times of prosperity was forgetfulness, which Moses repeatedly warned against. Forget in Hebrew is shakash, which is more than having a mental lapse about something or someone. It means to ignore, to cease to care. So people who have made it according to worldly standards are generally prone to quickly forget the history behind their success and the fact that God is the benefactor of their success. So, in like manner, it would be easy for the Israelites to believe that they had earned or deserved the right to enter into and live in the promised land after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But they needed to remember that it was God's goodness that they were gaining access to this promise. So, where it says, when thou hast eaten and art full, that refers to the enjoyment of God's provisions for them. And this statement coincides with the idea of giving thanks or saying grace before and after meals, which is a Jewish tradition and is also practiced in most Christian homes. Now, this gives the impression that there is nothing wrong with enjoying natural things with which God has blessed us, but it also annuls the fallacy that those who live according to ordinances of God, or the ordinance of the Lord, should live joyless and unhappy lives. But that's not so. This type of enjoyment should be anchored in consistent spirit of gratitude to God, Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides all things. So when life is great, they are enjoying the blessings of the Lord. It could be easy to forge hundreds of years of slavery, or forget hundreds of years of slavery that their ancestors endured, or even them wandering through the desert before God delivered them. So the years their people spent in the wilderness could become a faint memory. And Moses understood the tendency in human nature to forget the first-hand experience. Now, the number of people that left Egypt was 600,000 men, and that's not even including and women and children. And we see that in Exodus 12 and 37. So this number must have at least doubled before they even got to the promised land, if you consider births and deaths that occurred along the way. Now, to care for this number of people after such a long time, that would be, it almost seems like it would be impossible. It's a tremendous responsibility, but it's not impossible for God, who supplied the needs of each and every person present. So there was no room for them to be arrogant. There was nothing they could have done in their own power to survive 40 years in the wilderness like that without resources, because God was the source. Now, Moses cautioned the people of Israel against claiming self sufficiency, and they had done, on many occasions, given themselves credit for their, their, I would say, giving themselves credit for what they had. So in the desert, this is what led to their downfall. Now, Proverbs 16 and 18 says that pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, the feeling of self sufficiency can only exist when one has forgotten about the blessings of God. And instead of being prideful and claiming that they had achieved their prosperity through their own power, Moses repeated to them, "Remember the Lord thy God." Remember that God gave them the ability to acquire wealth. We should remember that as well. If you got breath in your body, if you have the activities of your limbs, and you're blessed with a good job, and God has blessed you with wealth, even if your wealth is your family, you have to give credit to God, because it is He that sustains you in good health so that you're able to go out and obtain the wealth or earn the wealth that you have. So, wealth in itself is actually not a sin, but it becomes a sin when it is used in actually contrary to the will and law of the Lord, or when it's acquired by illegal and wicked means. And it also becomes sinful when we occupy our hearts and minds with our wealth rather than the Lord and His law. So when we worship our wealth instead of the giver of our wealth, that's when it becomes a sin. We see this in Psalms 24 and 1, Psalm 115:16, and James 1 and 17. So we have an obligation to remember the Lord by ascribing Him all the glory and honor due to Him for all the blessings that He bestows on His people. Now, all of the difficulties and obstacles that Israel endured in the wilderness was actually a test to their humility and allegiance to God. We see that in verse 2 through 3, as well as 16. And it was to prepare them for what was to come in the promised land. Israel is admonished to remember that not only wealth, but power and the ability to gain wealth is a gift from God. And if they were to forget what God had done for them and where He brought them from, they would be susceptible to rebellion against God. And that leaves room for sin, which would lead them to destruction and a breach of their covenant with God, which is their contract with God. Now, disobedience does demonstrate a lack of love for the Lord. I would say this even applies to disrespect to your parents. So, their distinction from other nations was that the people heard and obeyed the voice of the Lord. So, if they no longer took heed to His voice, they would lose their distinguishing characteristics and suffer a terrible fate. And what set them apart from everyone else is their relationship with God, how they were obedient to them, and how God moved on their behalf because they were His chosen people. So, what can we do with what we've learned today? We need to remember that in everything that we do it to give glory and honor to God. Anything that we have in life, no matter how big or small it is, we need to give credit and glory to God for that. Because scripture tells us that even if He clothes the lilies in the valleys, how much so would He not clothe us? So we need to remember the source from which all of our blessings come from and give Him credit where credit is due. And that's it. That's the lesson. That is all I have for you. I hope that you learned something new. I hope you were blessed by the lesson. And most importantly, I hope you'll come back and join us next week. Until we meet again, God bless.